As a sophomore in college, that was a few years ago, Heath, a sophomore in college, Vanessa and I, we had a class together. It was physical geography, a fascinating course in many respects, very eye-opening. But there was a neat thought that was put in front of everyone of us that was shared as a fact. And this is that in southeastern Missouri, and Missouri's only true mountain range, the San Francisco Mountains, they're not extremely high, but you have the highest point, of course, in Missouri found there in Tom Sauk Mountain, 1,772 feet in elevation above sea level. But as well, we were told that those are some of the oldest dated rocks on the planet. And I thought, well, that's really cool. And I was told they're dated to be 1 to 2 billion years old. I thought, fascinating. I didn't realize the Earth was that old. I didn't believe that, by the way, at the time. But that's what was shared with us. And of course, the giant boulders, I'm sure most of you have seen it, in Elephant Rocks State Park, and then Johnson's Shut-ins State Park, the rhyolite formations that are located there, of course, from potentially volcanic activity back in the years, unless it was made in that mature form. But I thought that was really fascinating to hear that we maybe have a claim to fame in Missouri. Some of the oldest dated rocks on the planet, 1 to 2 billion years old. And it does sound fascinating. As a young person, that is impressionable on your mind. But what we're going to be exploring for our study together in the worship hour is that actually the case? Is that true? Are there rocks on this planet? Is there anything found in the range of billions of years old? And really, it's all going to depend on which perspective you hold. If you believe in a very old Earth, then you would probably be convinced, yeah, those rocks are 1 to 2 billion years old. Although if you believe in a young Earth, that it may only be thousands of years old, we have a little bit of a problem there that we need to explore. It all depends on your perspective. And we're going to be looking at the age of the Earth from 3 possible perspectives. The first one's not going to take very long at all. We're going to look at the age of the Earth from the Bible's standpoint. And really, it's as simple, AJ, as what you just read in Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. The great servant and leader of God's people, Moses, writing these words, he says, in 4 and 6 days, this is the expanse of the 10 Commandments, by the way, but he says, for 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day, and he hallowed, or he sanctified it. In 6 days, God made everything. The word is translated day from the Hebrew yom, and anytime that's used in non-prophetic writings, it always, consistently, everywhere in the Old Testament refers to a literal 24-hour period. And so what's being stated in Exodus 20, the claim is being made that in only 6 literal 24-hour periods, God made the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, the galaxies, including this one and everything that is found on it. 6 literal 24-hour periods. And here's why that's helpful biblically in dating the age of the Earth. Of course, you and I live about the year AD 2000. I know it's 2023. We're going to round it to the nearest century. Okay, throw me a bone here. AD 2000 is about where it is that we reside right now. Historically, we can trace back from our time that Jesus, and of course makes sense, split time, as time was split wrong by people, but it was about at the split of time. So from us to Jesus is about 2,000 years. Well, then there are all these genealogies found in the Bible, and you can do the average age of a culture, of a generation, and you can go back from that to the time period of Abraham, and that's about 2,000 years. You can use the genealogies that are found, especially in the Table of Nations in the 10th chapter of Genesis, and you can go from the time period of Abraham all the way back to 4,000 roughly BC, which is when Adam and Eve would have lived in the creation of the universe. And so if you ever want to try to remember biblically about how old is the earth, just remember the number 2,000 and you're pretty much good. So we live about in the year 2000. Go back from there, and Jesus, 2,000 years ago, you have him on the earth. Go back about 2,000 years from that, and you have Abraham. Go back about 2,000 years from that, and you have Adam and Eve. So roughly 6,000 years from the Bible. And we're told about creation. All of it was done from scratch in 6 literal 24-hour periods. And so you pretty much just stay there at the point. Biblically, the earth dates to be about 6,000 years old. Now that's from a creationist or from a Bible believer's perspective. Of course, not everyone believes in God and not everyone believes in Scripture. What about from an evolutionary standpoint? How old would the age of the earth be in that instance. So let's try to look back and let's try to figure out why this claim is made. All right, so from an evolutionist perspective, the Earth is relatively young, I've been told before. It's only 4.6 billion with a B, big B, 4.6 billion years old. Whereas the universe, well, that's quite a bit older. It's about 10. For a while it was thought about 12 billion, and now, no, it's not quite that old. It's only about 10 billion years old now, we're told. But the question comes in, how do we know that that's the case? This is presented as fact regularly in science books and among college professors and the scientific community and all across academia. How is it that we know that the Earth is this old and the universe dates to this age? Well, we're told this is according to the standards of science. It comes from a process called radiometric dating. And it's really neat how this works. For those who have been in physical science, your freshman year of high school, and chemistry later on, and physics also, you probably recall the periodic table, and maybe even from before that. Well, every element on that periodic table has a shelf life. Human beings have a shelf life, even though we're made of many elements. Our average lifespan is 80 years. Well, what's called a half-life in science of a human lifespan would be, cut that in half, 40 years. And after 2 half-lives, you have no human being left, on average. We die by that point. Well, the same thing is true with elements, although nothing is created or destroyed, you might have learned in your first class in nature, but elements do transition over into other elements over time. For instance, the radiometric dating method using uranium, if you'll notice, uranium has a lifespan of 2 half-lives, or we put half plus a half is one whole. And what happens over the lifespan of uranium is that by the end, all the uranium elements, or essentially all of them, have transitioned over into PB. That's not peanut butter. Don't try to eat it. That's lead. Okay, that's toxic to you. But it transitions over into lead. This is called the uranium-lead dating method. And it's pretty handy because you can test how much uranium, known by the life cycle of it, is found in a specimen. And if it's about at a half-life, you'll have about half of the original uranium in it. After 2 half-lives, you'll have either no or next to no uranium left. So that kind of makes sense. There are a lot of different dating methods. The potassium, argon, we're going to talk about hydrogen goes into helium over time. Well, that's normal, but this is one that is commonly used among others. And we're told by these radiometric dating methods of science, it's scientific, it's foolproof, it's just the way it is, no feelings are put into it, it's very objective, and we have dated things to be billions of years. The Earth appears to be 4.6 billion, the universe 10 billion, based on the radiometric dating methods of science. Okay, sounds like an open shut case. But what I want to do for just a few minutes is to explore, well, just how accurate are these dating methods of science? Because there are a lot of assumptions, a lot of guesses that are made in it that are just accepted as, well, this is our benchmark of fact, even though those haven't been proven yet. And how do you compare that to something where you know the age of its billions of years when nobody was around to have seen and to be able to visibly say, yeah, okay, I know for sure. And so what a group of scientists did is they used the potassium-argon method, just choosing one of these, and they dated some specimens of things where the ages of them were actually known, and then compared to the results, and I want to share just a few of those with you. For instance, in Hawaii and around Hawaii, there are all these active volcanoes and there are formations that are coming, all kinds of new rock that's being developed. Well, there was some submarine basaltic rock that was tested. And that means it's under the water. There's a lot of that in Hawaii. And the dates that were yielded using this scientific radiometric dating method came out to be 160 million to almost 3 billion years old. So maybe even older than some of the dated rocks that are close to us that we thought, well, we had some of the oldest. Well, there could be some that are older, apparently. So we've lost our claim to fame. The only problem is the natives of that area know that they're only 200 years old. 2 centuries back, they weren't there. But at only 200 years old, they dated to be 160 to almost 3 billion years in age. The shells of living mollusks were dated, and they were found to be 2,300 years old. I don't know if you caught what I said just a moment ago. These snails were alive, and they dated to be 2,300 years old. I'm no expert on snails and their lifespans, but I'm very confident they don't live to be greater than 2 millennia. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Something doesn't seem right. Freshly killed seals were dated to be 1,300 years old. Did you hear what I said? Freshly killed seals were dated to be 1,300 years old. There was a mummified seal that was dated to be 4,600 years old. But it was a controlled specimen that had been mummified and only in that state for about 30 years. And yet it yielded an age of 4,600 years. Kind of interesting when you compare it to things that you know their age to be and see what kind of ages are being yielded. This may be my favorite, a musk ox, it's kind of like the woolly mammoth of old, a very hairy creature, uses that for its warmth. A musk ox that had been preserved was tested, and its muscle tissue dated to be 24,000 years old. Well, that's a problem for a creationist, right? Because that's 4 times older than the universe is. By the way, we look at things and what the Bible teaches. But we found a strange anomaly in the dating process. The hair of the creature was also dated, and it only came to 7,200 years old. So if we're to accept the results of this, here's what occurred. The animal died about 17,000 years ago, about 24,000 years ago, and 17,000 years later it started sprouting hair. So there's hope for some of it. Yeah, it could happen. You just really never know. It doesn't make it, that's not possible. That's not the way biology works. There are some discrepancies of a major nature in these dating methods. But did you know that there are about 100, actually greater than that, dating methods of science? And of all of those, roughly 70 of those provide support to the earth being very young, in the range of only 1,000 years. Only about 3 out of 10 will suggest it could be older than that. So if you want to talk about just more evidence, the collection as far as dating goes is actually in the creationist corner as compared to the evolutionary one. But I want to spend just a few minutes in explaining to you why all this dating stuff really doesn't make any difference anyway. It's based on the theory of apparent age, how old something is compared to how old it appears to be, because there can be a difference between the two. And it really comes back to the age-old argument, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And so if the egg came first, then you can say, well, whatever age is yielded, then that's 100% accurate. But if the chicken came first, the chicken's going to appear to be older than it actually is. And I want to consider this from a biblical perspective. Of course, God made, we're told in Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, every tree of the earth come out of the ground. He planted a garden eastward in Eden. He puts the man in it. And human beings are eating fruit from these trees. Undoubtedly, they're getting shade from them, meaning these trees were created to be completely mature on the day that they were made. You've probably learned, you kids, that you can cut, and unfortunately you have to cut down the tree to do this, but you can cut down a tree to accurately date it to the exact year of age. We had a neighbor help us. He worked with strangely, lives in our neighborhood. We move into it. We find out that he worked with my uncle for a decade in southeastern Missouri in the U.S. Forestry Department. He noticed we had a big dead red oak in our yard, and he offered to come help us to fall the tree and to cut it up. I said, absolutely. He's a really nice guy. And so we put the tree, put it down just exactly where I wanted it to go, very strategic. And I asked him before we did, how old do you think that tree is? I don't know a lot about this kind of stuff. And he said, well, red oaks in the Ozarks tend to live about 120 years. He said they pretty much don't go past that. He said, I can tell by looking at it, that's its lifespan. I'm going to say 120 years. And we cut down the tree, and after the tree had fallen, he wipes it off with his gloves, takes his glove off, and we go through and we count all the rings together. Every ring represents 1 year of life. And if I recall, we came to 117. So he was 3 years off. And I thought, that's pretty impressive. And he said, yeah, it's 120 years. They don't go beyond that. That's their lifespan in the Ozarks. Well, if we were to cut down some of the trees that God created early on, and we were to count the rings found in all those trees, we probably would have had some trees that were for sure decades old, probably hundreds. Depending on the species, you might even have had a tree or two that could have been dated to be 1,000 years old, perfectly scientifically accurate. But on day 6 of the creation, when human beings come around to cut down trees and count the rings, how long have those mature trees actually been around? but just a few days. They would date, and properly, scientifically, to be many years, maybe hundreds or perhaps even 1,000 years old, even though they're only a few days old by day 6 of creation. You see, understand the concept of apparent age. What about human beings themselves? God forms Adam from the dust of the earth. He breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and immediately he has his first full-time job for him. He says, I'm going to put you in the garden, and you're going to be a gardener, a farmer. You go in there and you work it. He's obviously big and strong enough that he can do physical tasks. He's of a mental capacity. He can process information. He's involved in all the naming of the animals. He's probably at least in his late teens. For Eve's sake, I hope he was at least in his 20s or 30s by this point. Maybe even 40 or 50. And if you were to date Adam on day 6 of creation, say by the size of his femur or by his teeth, his jawbone or his cranium, you can tell this is probably a male. And scientifically, how old would Adam date to be on day 6 of creation? Anywhere from late teens, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. But in reality, on day 6 of creation, how old would Adam be? Less than 1 day. You see, the theory of apparent age, just because something appears to be old doesn't mean that it's actually that way. The first anesthesia and the first surgery are implemented and performed in Genesis 2. A rib's taken from Adam's side, formed into a woman. He brings her to Adam on that day, and Adam gives his wedding vows. He says, this is my bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. And therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. They get married. How old do people have to be to marry? Hopefully at least late teens. Don't get any ideas. 20s is good. Okay, that's a good time to... all right, maybe on average 25, 30 years old. They're getting married on day 6 of creation. When the wedding is performed, how old would they appear to be? Late teens at least, probably 20s, 30s, maybe 40s, or even 50s. Yet they're less than 24 hours old. You see the theory of apparent age. Now, understanding that to be the case, the rocks on the planet, how old do you think they would look? How old do you think the rocks on the planet would scientifically, if you had an accurate dating method, which we haven't really been able to prove we do. But if we do, how old would those rocks date to be? They would look like, and maybe test to be billions of years old, even though they're only a few days old. Do you see really why the dating argument doesn't make any difference? Because of the concept of apparent age from Scripture. Now, I don't want you just to take my word for these things when we talk about the age of the earth. We're going to look at a few really respected evolutionists and what their thoughts were, very accomplished in their scientific circles, and what they had to say about the age of the earth. The first of these that we're going to discuss. This gentleman, he has some credentials. Dr. Stephen Morbath was an evolutionist associated with the University of Oxford. He was a professor there for many years. He actually founded a group and ran it while he was a professor at the school. But Dr. Stephen Morbath, here's what he has to say about the planet's age. There is no scientific proof that the earth is billions of years old. The average layman thinks there is, but he is mistaken. Your average Joe and Jane think, well, it's a settled fact. The Earth's 4.6 billion years old. That's pretty exact. And the universe, 10 billion. Well, why would we think that to be scientific fact? Because that's what we've always been given in the textbooks that we've had. And that's what our teachers and our professors, the smart people who are educated, who have always told us. It's settled. There's no question about it. One of the most respected scientific minds of his day. There is no proof of it. Now, this guy's not a creationist. He's an evolutionist. He says, I have no evidence to prove my position. The evidence for the age of the earth is circumstantial, being based upon indirect reasoning. In other words, there are assumptions and guesses that have been made that have been established as benchmark of fact, when in reality, they're unprovable tenets. And so there's no evidence that it's really that old. The second one that I'd like to bring to your attention is Dr. John Eddy. Mr. Eddy was an evolutionary astronomer. Some would regard him among the preeminent astronomers of the entire 20th century. And I was telling you about in class, I feel like the sun gets overlooked. This was the guy's specialty. He felt so also. He really studied the sun, and here was his reflection on what he had found as far as evidence and age go. There is no evidence based solely on solar observations that the sun is 4.5 to 4.5 billion years old. I suspect that the sun is 4.5 billion years old. He's not a creationist. He's an evolutionist. He says, I believe this to be the case, but in all my years of researching, I have not found a single piece of evidence that establishes that age. However, given some new and unexpected results to the contrary. In other words, the more we dig, the more we're finding evidence toward a young earth and not an old earth, a young sun and not an old sun. I guess that we can live with Bishop Ussher's value for the age of the earth and the sun. If you're not familiar with Bishop Ussher, he was a 17th century theologian. He was an Anglican man, and he was not just a bishop, but he was the archbishop of the entire Church of Ireland. And he is famed for having gone through Scripture and history. He believes that he dated the creation to the exact year, 4004 BC, to the exact month, October, to the exact day, the 27th, and I don't remember the time, but like 4:04 p.m. I don't know about that, okay? But simply this, he dated all things to be 6,000 years old. And this man, one of the most respected astronomers of an evolutionary background of the entire 20th century, said in all my research, of all the evidence I found, is nothing to prove that the sun's billions of years old. In fact, I'm finding evidence to the contrary of that, of a much younger sun. And he said, I don't really know how to argue with the religious guy who in the 17th century said the sun is 6,000 years old. I guess we could live with what it is that he put forth. Why do we never hear these statements from such renowned figures? I have one more that I want to give you. Mr. Frederick B. Juneman, a very talented fellow. He composed musical pieces. He was an accomplished author, but in the scientific community, his background is in chemistry, and he's most well known for serving as a contributor and an editor for two publications, Research and Discovery, and the second one, Eons. Again, he was a contributor and an editor of both of those publications for 30 years. Background in chemistry. He says the age of our globe is presently thought to be some 4.5 billion years, based on radio decay rates of uranium. We already talked about that. Uranium turns into not peanut butter, but lead. You don't want to eat that, okay? And also thorium. He says there has been in recent years, though, the horrible realization that radio decay rates are not as constant as previously thought. In other words, we can't rely on them as fact like we once did, nor are they prone to environmental influences. And this could mean that the atomic clocks or the elemental composition, the radiometric details, could have been reset during some global disaster. Let's just pause right there for a moment. If you're a Bible believer, do you know of any global disaster that could have reset the elemental composition of everything so now it wouldn't be safe to trust the radiometric composition of substances as you try to date them? It may not be 65 million years ago. This is awful, he says. We don't know if we can trust the time frame anymore. But rather within the age and memory of man. Now, like the previous ones, this guy was not a creationist. He believed in evolution. He spent his life trying to prove the points of it. But these guys have this in common, and I appreciate about them. They're honest enough to look at the evidence and to report the things that it is they found. Don't take my word for it. Take those in the camp and their own word, very accomplished scientists, when they say there is absolutely no proof that the earth and the universe is billions of years old. I feel like we've been a little biased, though, in the things that we've discussed. We've looked at it from the Bible's perspective. We looked at it from evolutionists' perspective. Why don't we just be a little more unbiased? Let's take a step back and let's look at it from the standpoint of nature. What does nature have to say about the age of the earth? The magnetic field of the earth is constantly decaying. There was an in-depth government report that was produced a few years ago that established that the earth's magnetic field is shrinking at a rate so that it will be gone by the year 3,991. We won't be around at that point, but the law of entropy, everything wears down until it wears out over time. Professor Thomas G. Barnes, who served at the University of Texas El Paso in the Department of Physics, he calculated the magnetic field of the earth could be no more than 10,000 years old based on this decay rate. He says you go back any more than 10,000 years, it creates such a large magnetic field for the planet that as magnets do, it couldn't hold itself together. It would rupture and crack. It'd blow itself apart. But if it's less than 10,000 years and you compare the decay rate, that makes perfect sense. That would be about what the age of the Earth is. It's possible to compute the world's population. There's a formula, Marty, a mathematical formula by which you can do that. And whenever you put evolutionary years into this formula, you find out that the Earth should possess right now a population of 1 times 10 to the 5,000th power. 1 times 10 to the 5,000th power. If evolution is true, that's how many people should be living on the Earth. The only problem is the entire universe, not the Earth, the entire universe could only hold 1 times 10 to the 100th power, which means that 50 times beyond capacity of the universe. That doesn't add up. But if you put creationist numbers of less than 10,000 years into the formula, then you compute the population is in the billions and less than 10 billion, which is exactly what it is. We said a little over 8 billion persons on the planet right now. The creationist time frame matches up, the evolutionist one does not. We mentioned about how over time some elements transition into others. For instance, hydrogen transitions over into helium over a period of time. This is only a one-way process, and hydrogen cannot be produced in any other significant means. So we are winding down in the universe in hydrogen, just like the universe was made to operate. This should mean that if the universe were very old, there would be next to no hydrogen left in it. However, hydrogen remains the most abundant element in the universe. Sir Fred Hoyle, a British astronomer and cosmologist, stated the universe consists almost entirely of hydrogen. A British guy, so it's the language. How comes it then, he said, that the universe consists almost entirely of hydrogen? If matter were indefinitely old, this would be quite impossible. So then we see that the universe being what it is, the creation issue simply cannot be dodged. That is evidence for a young Earth. Stalagmites and stalactites, and if you're wondering the difference between them, ground, they come up. Stalactites, ceiling, and they come down, and sometimes they come together and they form columns. Stalagmites and stalactites have been used as proof for an old Earth. Evolutionists have long claimed that it takes millions of years for them to form, and so that helps to prove the antiquity of the planet. However, in a London tunnel that was closed in 1945, stalactites grew more than 24 inches in just 33 years. There was a photograph that was published in 1953 by National Geographic that showed a stalagmite, that's the one that grows up from the ground, and it came up, grew so quickly, it covered a bat that fell on it and preserved the bat before it even had a chance to decompose. What is this? Rapidly forming stalactites and stalagmites and stalactites? That's not supposed to occur, but it happens on a regular basis. We've been told for so many years it's the fossil record. It's the fossil record that disproves creation and confirms evolutionary thinking. I would purport exactly the opposite. There are some incredible fossils that are found all around this planet. This is an extinct squid-like animal called a belemnite, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. And you can see it's not fossilized in a straight line. That's significant. But its tail curves around, and can you imagine what this creature would have looked like in person? There are preserved records in the stones of the earth of whole schools of fish. This is an extinct trout perch. And a whole school is plastered against this wall and is covered up very quickly before it even has a chance to decompose. About 15 years ago, there was a guy who was fishing in a river in Tennessee. And as he was going after these fish in the stream, he saw something strange sticking up out of the water. And he bent down and he kind of messed around. He picked it up and he noticed it was a modern fishing reel, which isn't strange. And every now and then you'll come across some gear, some tackle that gets lost in a stream. But what was strange about it, he noticed that half of it was fossilized already. A modern fishing reel. We hear in evolutionary thinking, well, fossils are millions of years old, and it takes millions of years for the fossils to form. How is a modern fishing reel already half fossilized? Could it be that we've messed up on the chronology of things and that actually fossils can develop much more rapidly than over a period of millions of years. Maybe the most convincing argument as to the age of the Earth from the field of geology is what's called polystrate fossils. Poly is a prefix that means many, and strate is taken from the scientific term strata, meaning layer. You've probably noticed in driving through the Ozarks and the limestone bluffs, it's like there are layers of rock that have been put down, and it does appear to be that way. These strata are many layers, and we're told that each one of these layers took millions of years to form. Well, if that's the case, there should be no such thing as a many-layered fossil, but they're found all over the globe. I'm going to give you a few examples of it. This one comes from southeastern Canada and the island and province of Nova Scotia. And this is a fossilized tree that passes through many layers of the rock ledge. Layer after layer after layer. Now, what do you know about a tree if it's left to the elements for a year, a couple years? It rots. It decomposes. This became fossilized through many layers before it ever had a chance to decompose. This supposedly took millions of years, each layer, to form. But the fact that it passes through all these layers is demonstrative of the reality that this fossil had to have formed. These layers had to have been put down in a period of probably a year or two, if not even less. Otherwise, the tree would have rotted and it couldn't have been preserved. Marty, this is in Tennessee. Examples of polystrate trees that are fossilized, passing through the rocks. This one isn't a photograph, but give the guy some credit. It's an 1891, and they're not very popular back then, photographs, very expensive and difficult to get. But he made a diagram, Herman Kredner did, in France, of what he found in a hillside. And he wrote, there are all these layers, you can tell by the diagram that he put pen to paper, and there are these trees, all kinds of them that are passing through all the layers. Had to have been formed rapidly in a period at the most of a year or two, otherwise the trees would have rotted and they couldn't have been preserved. It's not just true of trees, it's also the case with the animal kingdom. Trilobites are some extinct marine specimens, but you can see that these trilobite fossils pass through many layers of this rock, and individual ones going through multiple layers. Had to have been formed very rapidly, couldn't have happened over a span of millions of years. This is a very rare one right here. A school of jellyfish is preserved in the fossil record. Here's why that's so strange. Typically you see skeletal remains as fossils. What do you know about jellyfish? They have no skeletal system. And so they're not going to be around very long at all. Probably a matter of weeks or days these fossils had to have formed. Otherwise, the jellyfish would have already been decomposed. And yet these jellyfish in the school pass through 7 layers of earth. And we're supposed to believe that this part of the jellyfish got preserved over millions of years, and then this part over millions of years, and this part over millions of years. It all happened within a matter of days or a day, maybe even hours, when sediment suddenly rushed upon them. You know of any event from the Bible where sediment would have gotten pushed very rapidly upon things so that they couldn't have escaped? This is a really neat one. Near Lompoc, California, Nick, 1976, there was a fossilized whale that was discovered. It appeared standing on its tail. Now, both creationists and evolutionists, after they examined it, determined we don't think that it actually got fossilized on its tail, but probably it was lying on its side, and through the years, the soil has pushed it up, and that would make a lot of sense. Nevertheless, it passes through a dozen diatom layers of earth. This supposedly took millions of years each to be formed. No way it could have happened. Must have occurred very rapidly, not over a period of millions of years. Now, all this information is kind of interesting, but some people would say, and I've heard this before, what does it matter? If the Earth's thousands of years old, if the Earth is billions of years old, in the end, what difference does it make? I agree, it wouldn't make any difference if the one called God, whom we worship and serve, didn't give us any information about it. But when he tells us, based on the information provided, it's 6,000 years old, then I think it's a pretty important thing whenever God speaks. And if you can't trust God on a very simple matter that doesn't matter anyway, do you really think you could put your trust in him when it comes to the much bigger matters of an eternal nature? When he tells you to put your trust in me and be buried with my Son in baptism, and I will raise you to life, and you'll have joys untold in eternity. Well, if whenever he told you a very small thing that didn't matter and you couldn't trust him, how do you know you can trust him on the big thing about where you're going to spend forever? When you're struggling with sin and he tells you, confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous person makes a huge difference. Well, if that's what he's told you, but when you go back to a really small, insignificant scientific thing and you don't really know that you can rely on him for that, do you really know you can trust him to deal with your sin condition? But if you know, based on the evidence, regardless of what people say, noise doesn't produce facts. And once it's all explored and the facts all scream out in one direction, that the earth is 6,000 years old, even though the most brilliant minds will tell you, no, it's billions of years old, you know you can put your confidence in him. And if you can do it in a small way, you can do it in a big way also. That's why these studies are so important. There are countless millions of people that have lost their faith over this small issue of the age of the earth, over this small issue of the origins of the universe, which leads me to the conclusion these are not small issues at all. These are huge issues. If you can trust God in the small things, you can trust God in the big things also. And now that you know you can trust him in the small things, come put your trust in him for the big things while we stand and we sing together.